Well, okay, so we're just filling up. Oh, hi again, everyone. Just making sure everyone's back. Are we ready to go? All good? Okay, cool. All good. Thanks. So hi everyone. I'm Emily Marlow. I'm based in Sheffield, in the UK. This panel that we're going to start with is called Games Preservation, Games and Digital Preservation Practices in Museums and Galleries. So we're going to be talking about games preservation around the world, and some of the practices used within games museums as well as larger museums, which include games libraries. We have three great speakers for today, and we're going to hear from all three in order, and then we're going to go for some Q&As after the fact. Please do put any questions you have for the speakers or any comments in the chat below, and we'll try to get through them all at the end. So our first speaker is Wytze Koppelman, who works as curator at the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision in Hilversum, and they're going to be beginning our talks today. So over to you.
Yeah, I'll just share my screen. Let's see. There we go. Can everyone see my presentation? Hear me okay? I'm not hearing anything, so I'm guessing yes. Good that you're all here. Thank you for joining. My name is Wytze Koppelman. I work at the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision. That's located in Hilversum. And I work there as a curator. And being a curator, half of my job contains preservation of media, and the other half contains presentation of media. And for me, they are inextricably bound together. So I will be talking.
So just 1 second. Could you full screen your presentation? We're looking at
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Everyone seeing it now? As long as I'm not hearing anything, I'm guessing yes.
All good, all good. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Okay. My name is Wytze Koppelman. I work as a curator at the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision. And today we will be talking about games as heritage in practice, well, the sound and vision approach. And I want to take you along in the formational story of how we started with game preservation, what we preserve. And as I've said a bit before, I work there as a curator. So one half of my job is preserving video games, among other things, of course. And the other half is presenting video games. For me, they are inextricably bound. And that is also one of the working modes of our institute. So I want to highlight both of these halves, both of these approaches. Of course, one can't live without the other, to give you a bit of an idea as to how sound and vision approaches the medium of video games from both sides. And I hope to, well, maybe pique your interest, raise some questions for the Q&A we'll have afterwards, the discussion. And I'm saying a lot of things about the choices that we did make, but also maybe look out for what I'm not telling the ghost notes as to the approaches that we didn't take. Hopefully our other participants in the panel will also highlight their approach, and we will see some differences, which will give us something to talk about when we get to the discussion part. But first off, to start, I work at Sound and Vision. This is Sound and Vision. It's located in Hilversum on the Media Park, and Hilversum is pretty much the heart of broadcasting in the Netherlands. And historically speaking, we are also a broadcasting institute. So most of our collection that we have consists of, well, broadcasting media. Maybe someone's visited Sound and Vision already. I know a few colleagues of mine are also in this presentation. Small shout out to you. And if not, of course, you are welcome to visit. This is the outside. And when you visit, this is the inside. And interestingly enough, if you see it like this, our building is constructed in a pretty straightforward manner, which also corresponds to the three main functions that we have as an institute. One being we have a museum, which hangs there between the tiles in the sky. The other is we are a research institute. This picture was taken from the perspective of our offices. The arrow pointing right is pointing to our offices where my research colleagues are located. And the last one is the archive, which is located below ground in our building. And we have 5 floors going below ground where we store both our physical and our digital archive. From what I've said, we are a broadcasting archive by heart, and that gives an interesting perspective onto the development of media in general. Most of the broadcasters that we have are public broadcasters who are starting to experiment more with digital media. So we have taken the journey from becoming, let's say, a media archive to becoming a multimedia archive. But if I say multimedia, that's already a term that's a bit dated. Media, of course, kind of like flows on the waves of time, and what media is in general is also changing. So we, as an archive, have taken on the perspective of being more of a media archive where we are not so much hardware oriented and more, let's say, software or content oriented. What I mean by that is that it's more about the contents of the media that's being shown and maybe the culture around it, the culture of television, the culture of radio, the culture of video games, than say archiving televisions, archiving consoles, archiving radios. Though, mind you, we also have that. And that kind of like maybe already a bit suggests that our approach is more on the content and also more on the digital sides. Here you see most of the carriers that we have, a lot of film lying around, but we digitize most of our archive, and that is actually the core part of our archive, that most of the collection, new collection material that we get is digitized. Most media industries, be they video games, be they television, be they radio, work in a digital manner. So this isn't that strange of an approach, of course, but it's always good to mention because the core part of what we archive and what we want to achieve with the things that we archive, be they programs or be they video games, of course, is to make a digital copy, which we can then also make available through certain channels, of course, always with agreement from rights holders. And I'm showing a lot of digital material here, and I've said television a few times, but we are, of course, talking about video games. And this is our video game collection. It's not as big as what we have when it comes to radio and television, but it's growing. And this is, of course, everything that we have in a physical form in our archive, and not so much that what we have in a digital form, in the sense that there are also a lot of, well, let's say, smaller game studios in the Netherlands who mostly work in digital distribution for the games, and a physical release, of course, costs money. And you can also maybe see here that a lot of the stuff that we have that is a bit older, from the Commodore 64, the green ones, and the upper shelf, a lot of CD-ROMs from the 90s, lower shelves, more PS5, PS4, Nintendo titles that are just a few years old. But let me not get ahead of myself. First, I want to take a short detour and dive more into the research part of our archive, because how video game archiving came into being in our archive was through a research project. We're going back to the to the year 2016. It's become quite a hit, of course, these last couple of months on the internet to look back at 2016. We also very nostalgically look back on that year because we had a exhibit at Sound and Vision that was called Let's YouTube. And on YouTube, again, talking about content, one of the bigger areas of content that you have, of course, on YouTube is gaming content. So we also dove a bit more into gaming content. For those in the know, the guy with the cardboard screen on his head is Gameneer. That's one of the biggest Dutch game YouTubers. He was the face for this exhibit. And we had a few arcade cabinets, not Dutch arcade cabinets, by the way, which you can see right below. We also held a symposium about what is actually the meaning and what will be the worth of archiving video games, because before this moment there was zero video gaming content in our collection. And upper right, I've also attached a small photograph to kind of like hark back to 10 years ago and already show that when we're talking about VR in museums or GLAM institutions for that matter, well, this is still pretty much the going rate, you know. You see someone with a VR set on his head that's available there. And these are the kinds of pictures we still have in our archive. A bit of a cliffhanger because I'm going to come back to this later on. But from that symposium, we had more or less our starting point to dive more into these questions that we asked ourselves during the symposium. How can you archive a video game, and what would be important to archive a video game? On the left, you see the Game Shape Archive. It's a research paper that was written by my ex-colleague, Jesse de Vos. He no longer works at us. He made this paper in 2017, and this research paper was more or less the starting point, let's say the asking questions point of how we could approach as Sound and Vision the questions of archiving of video games. He set out a multitude of approaches, be it a physical archival project, just storing the carriers, the CD-ROMs, the cartridges, of course, or, for example, working through emulation. He raised those questions, and from there we actually practically started working to see what worked best. But to have a more or less, let's say, public face and an easy landing platform as to what we are actually talking about, not just from a research perspective, but also from a public perspective. Again, we work in presentation and preservation in that sense. We made a concrete product, which is a website, but that website is the Dutch Games Canon. We worked with a few panels and sessions of a multitude of experts, be they archivists, historians, game makers, networking experts within the industries, legends, mainstays, to get a list of the games that are from the Netherlands that would be worth archiving, to answer the question, okay, if we are going to archive video games, where do we even start? I mean, most histories that are told about games in general, let's say in a particular manner, are usually focused, let's say more US-centric, Japan-centric, maybe UK-centric, but local industries or local history industry stories aren't that well known. From those sessions came a list of 70-odd titles that were deemed interesting, be they artistic or from a technical manner, or most important, most sold games in the Netherlands, to give us a list of titles that were made in, the oldest game is from 1980 that we have. The newest game, at least in this rendition of the canon, is from 2017. To give us a list of the games that are seen as most important. And of course, on the one hand, this is a list and it is a canon, so it's a movable thing and it's a discussion point. I mean, it's not finite and it will be changed over time, but it's something to get the discussion going. And on the other hand, it was a tool for us because it gave us a list to go out and approach the rights holders to see if we could archive those titles. And that's our starting point, where we started archiving or making our games collection. Then we're going to dive more into the archive perspective, the preservation perspective of it. Our backbone with that is that we made a workflow of actually how to go about when we're talking about archiving video games. Now, there are a few important choices and points I want to highlight in this. The first one is active acquisition. Most game makers, who are, of course, the rights holders to these games, do not know that we have started archiving video games. So we had to reach out to them, do an active approach as to we would like to store your game as cultural heritage, to make it part of our collection and to preserve it for eternity. At least that is a promise that we give game makers. And it is also, of course, our aim to have this game in a playable condition in our archive 100 years from now. Maybe to compare this to the television part, which I mentioned before, the broadcasting part. We are so far in that most broadcasters have to help us in archiving their material. Stronger still, it's part of the Dutch media law that there has to be an archive for broadcasting material. There is no such thing when it comes to, digital media in general, but games very much not the question. So we have to work actively with these rights holders to get these games into our archive. If we don't have a signed contract, we cannot necessarily do anything with this video game. We can, of course, buy a copy off the shelf if it is available off the shelf. a digital shelf is, of course, also an interesting story in that sense. But we cannot make the game available for either cultural, educational, or research purposes, because for that in the Netherlands we need the permission to do that from the rights holders. Also, when we make this available in any of those three manners, we ask for permission from the rights holder. So we have to get an agreement first. The core thing, what comes out of this workflow, is that we have chosen to do archiving by emulation. I'm going to dive into that a bit more in the next slide. But that, again, is a core digital product, just as we do with other media that we store in our archive. And there's a small shout out I want to give here to the OOC that I've mentioned, the out of commerce ruling, which is a bit of a new ruling which makes it available if rights holders cannot be found and a game is out of commerce, so it's not commercially available on, let's say, a platform such as GOG or such as Steam, that it gives us a bit of a legal loophole, so to say, that we can give a shout out around the world that we want to make this game available for cultural purposes as cultural heritage. Someone can say, this is my game, and if someone doesn't, in 6 months, we can broaden the scope of things that we can do with that archived video games. One of the prerequisites, of course, is that it is a part of our collection. So in that sense, it creates a new loophole, and this is something that is very new for us, that we can also use to get older games in our collection, of which we try to find the rights holders. We can't find them, but we can still add them to our collection and make them available, hopefully in another way. As I've said, still new, so we're still working as to how we can actually make these games available if we are within the legal bounds to make them available. And from the backbone, we go to the core of our archive, preservation by emulation. My colleague Willem Hilhorst is also, I think, in this session, and he is going to do a lightning talk to dive a bit more into the nitty-gritty and the technical side of emulation. So from that perspective, I won't be telling that much about this. But when it comes to emulation, we make a package so we can make the game available. This harks back to the preservation and presentation combination, that we want to make the material that we archive in our archive, because we are also a museum, reusable to the public, be it that they can experience it in a museum, but also, for example, for researchers, that they can do research into modes of gameplay that were popular in the Netherlands in the 1980s or in the 1990s. But it all starts with being able to make that available. And this also kind of shows that we aren't that hardware-centric when it comes to archiving our media. Maybe to make the comparison also to television and radio, we also do not use old television sets to view television programs from the 1980s. No, we make it available so it can be seen and experienced on the most modern technologies. And that is also the easiest way for us to keep it alive, let's say 100 years from now, so that we aren't dependent on having a C64 working, lying around on the one hand, but also, for example, if we want to exhibit in a museum, also have a pristine copy that is, from a curatorial object perspective, still good enough, pretty enough to show in a museum. So working in a digital manner in this sense also gives us a more leeway to be able to do a bit more with the media, archive media, and our games collection than just storing a physical copy that we make available on hardware. And besides the core being, of course, a copy of the game, of which we make a disk image, which Melanie also dove into a bit further in her presentation, but we, of course, also use disk images to make an emulation package, is that we started archiving those video games, but sooner rather than later, we also noticed that just archiving those video games makes it so that it's, of course, available for new generations, but it doesn't tell you necessarily that much about those games. So we've started broadening our scope as to what we actually collect in our archive. And when available, you've already seen this image, we also want to have a physical carrier for the game. And the packaging of the game, of course, also gives you a lot of information. Our games collection, when it comes to physical examples, isn't that big, but you can guess maybe that if you have enough material, it could tell you something. I had the pleasure of once visiting the Embracer Games archive, and I wanted to include this picture because it still impresses me. if you collect enough, then you can see that it also tells you something in a design manner, as a design archive. You can clearly see the Dreamcast titles in the light and a bit darker blue, and on the right, the black titles, the PS1 games, of course. Well, very clear design choices were made there. Of course, Embracer Games Archive archives all kinds of games from around the world. We, as a Dutch institute, a Dutch archive, only archive Dutch video games. The canon that I've shown earlier, that is our starting point. Those games we are working on to archive, and we're doing that in a, let's say, a structured, well-paced manner, so not too fast, more slowly. Also, of course, dictated by that we have to work with the rights holders, and we are dependent on them working with us to actually archive the games. Another context, context material that we have is documentation. On the right, you see Blow Up, a 1980s game made by Acosoft. 1.5 years ago, we got a big donation from Acosoft, and in that donation was also a design document. Well, you can kind of see the age of this document by the holes on the side, of course. This gives us an interesting insight into how this game actually came about, and gives us more material as to the meaning of the development process of this game. A lot of the material that we store as a working broadcasting archive means that you can see how television came about, and more from a media maker perspective than, let's say, a public general visitor perspective. And this also adds to that. Another example of what we have is the creative process in that sense. And this is from the game Herald, made by Dutch developer Wispfire. Wispfire actually approached us that they could give us a bit more than just their game, and that they also had a lot of material lying around which could give insights into their development process. I have a small example which shows how the animations in their game came about. I'll show it first. It's quite easy to see that the walk that one of the game developers is doing, they copied that to make the animation in their game. They were 4-man studio, so they aren't working with that many people. So using yourself is, of course, a very easy workaround in that sense. But that also shows as to how they approached their video game making process and how they went about making their video games. So the development history of the game next to the final game that we have also comes into being here. And that's, from our perspective, a very valuable source for research in the future. We are archivists, we are curators, we are not necessarily academics in that sense. So we try to have a fertile ground when it comes to our video game collection, to have extra material that also gives insight into the Dutch game making history in that sense. And that perspective as to what makes this Dutch game history is broadening and broadening. And one of the newest collections that we actually have is quite special, if you ask me. You're looking at a picture of the Dutch Game Garden. This was a central incubation studio, hangout, networking place, the living room of the Dutch games industry, as they were called by other people, not by themselves, but that's, of course, a badge of honor, so to say. They closed down last year, and they approached us. We have this large archive lying around, which is mostly documentation, but also other things, such as their YouTube channel with a lot of making of videos and presentations as to new Dutch games and how they were made. And on the left side, a photo archive of networking events that they have. This is, on the one hand, a bit of a far cry from a true video game, of course. But on the other hand, this shows exactly the culture that the games that we are actually archiving came into being. These networking lunch are still, because they are now hosted by a new organization, some of the most popular gaming events for the industry in the Netherlands. And most of the studios that are the bigger indie studios in the Netherlands were formed at the Dutch Game Garden, and people know each other from these network lunches. If you want an internship, you can go there. If you want a new job, you can go there. If you want to pitch your game, you can go there. So this shows more of, let's say, if you see these games as objects that we have, the lines between those games and the gestation of how they were made. This collection shows exactly that. So from that perspective, we also chose to archive this collection because it adds a lot to the material that we already have, though it presents a few difficulties when we're talking about presenting this, of course, because it's more documentation and photos than it is, for example, physical playable games and objects. A small shout out because we of course archive these games in our catalog. Willem will also dive into this a bit more. I've shown a few examples of differing materials that we have, from an audiovisual clip to photos to documents. All these, as far as possible, files will be, of course, digitized. But if you make a breakdown as to how you can actually see these things in our archive, well, I've got the example of Horizon Zero Dawn here. For that, we have an archived game of Horizon Zero Dawn. We have a physical copy because it got a physical release. We make an emulation package. You can make gameplay videos, which we, of course, also do to have at least an idea of how it is to play the game. If you ask me, the interaction is always in yourself playing the game and what that does to you. But this at least gives us an example, a facsimile of what it is to have this game playable. This structure makes it a bit complex to have a Horizon Zero Dawn collection, but we're still experimenting with that and working as to how we can make this easily accessible. Once again, Willem will dive into this a bit more in his lightning talk. Then I want to dive lastly into the museum perspective, the presentation perspective, what we also do at Sound and Vision.
Could we wrap up in a little bit? Sorry, we're running a little on time. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. One of the difficulties that we have is that we have made a museum that is a curated experience where we don't necessarily have older games from our collection that we have in a playable form. So this makes it a curated experience where you can experience about play in a museum, what it is to play a video game, but it gives us a bit of an issue as to showing the material within our collection. One example that I have is we have one VR goggle in the museum, and in all honesty, it's most of the time it's still broken. So that goes to show on the difficulties of actually having normal, let's say, home console games being playable in a museum. Very practical, but very real when it comes to presenting games in a museum setting in a GLAM institution. So what did we choose to do then? We are still experimenting with differing forms, temporary exhibits, smaller exhibits. We've made arcade cabinets that are playable and a bit idiot-proof when it comes to making them broken, to breaking them. And we host talks also such as this to dive more into specific parts of our archive. And lastly, we also give games on loan, which might also be interesting for other institutions here. I wanted to maybe wrap up with an interesting perspective when it comes to video games. They are more seen as, of course, design projects, commercial products. And on the left, you see two paintings made by Rembrandt. Our Dutch public broadcaster, news broadcaster, highlighted the Kanye West and Kim Kardashian when it comes to giving on loan between the Louvre and the Rijksmuseum these two paintings, and it's national news that they go on loan to a different museum, and maybe to give a bit of an insight when it comes to loaning video games, for example. The first we loaned in 2022. Well, on the left you see what it takes to put a painting on loan to a different museum, and on the right, well, giving free games on loan to a different Dutch museum, it was as easy as sending a WeTransfer. To wrap up, this gives hopefully a few perspectives on the one hand preservation, on the other hand presentation, and I'd be happy to dive into this a bit more at the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention, and that's it from me.
Well, thank you so much, Wytze. That was really interesting. I'm also, as a fan of architecture, that's an amazing building to be working in. Yeah. Brill. So again, if you've got any questions, just feel free to hold them till the end or pop them in the chat below. Our second speaker today is Dr. Tom Enson. He's a freelance digital conservator, and he works at the intersection of fields of art conservation and digital preservation. So I'll take it over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Emily. I'm just going to sort out my screen share. Cool. Can you see that? Great. Sorry, I'm just trying to move the Zoom sidebar so it's out of the way. Okay, so yeah, my name is Tom Enson. I am a freelance digital conservator. And basically that means I work with institutions, galleries and artists to support the long-term care of the digital materials that they look after. And my specialism really is in the preservation of software-based art, and much of my work in recent years has focused on this, and particularly real-time 3D rendering and contemporary game-making tools, which are things which I have seen become increasingly popular with artists and grow into cultural heritage collections in increasing numbers. So it's become a kind of pressing concern for people working in this field. I frequently work with Tate's time-based media conservation team, and it's this ongoing collaboration with their team which forms the basis of what I'll be talking about today. So this will be very Tate heavy. So I did just want to start with a bit of context before I jump into more of the detail. So software-based art, I don't know whether people have come across this term before, but it's the term we use in time-based media conservation to describe artworks where software is the primary medium. And these can look very, very different. It might be a room scale installation. It might be screen-based. It might be browser-based. They can look very different, but all of these involve software running somewhere while the work is displayed. It is still a relatively new media type in the conservation of time-based media art. Not sure how long I can go on saying that for, but at least in contrast to things like film and video, which have longer histories, it's still relatively new. So this chart shows the growth of software-based art in the Tate collection over the years. The first work was accessioned in 2003. There was quite a slow increase until around 2019, when numbers basically tripled in about 5 years. We're not sure what the trajectory will continue to be, but it certainly made the need for best practices even more pressing. Software-based art remains a relatively small component of the overall collection, but it is disproportionately high in terms of complexity. And that largely stems from software being particularly vulnerable to the effects of technological change, ultimately meaning that caring for them requires a lot of resources, often including specialist support. Furthermore, every artwork is its own unique challenge and project. We need to kind of unravel the way in which the artist has engaged with the software medium as part of the developing our strategy. So every artwork requires its own bespoke conservation plan, really. So all this amounts to, sometimes the number of conservation time days on a new software-based artwork acquisition into the collection exceeding 30 days, which is much higher than other moving image works. So that first work, which was accessioned at Tate in 2003, was Michael Craig Martin's Becoming, which is an animation made in Flash and presented on a wall-hung monitor with a computer concealed behind it. And it was through Pip Lawrenson and the team's pioneering work at this time that two of the key pillars of Tate's software-based art conservation strategy were established. One was sourcing of duplicate sets of hardware. So we would source another identical set of hardware, which in this case was done in close collaboration with the artists in the studio. The other is the archiving of source code for the work. In this case, the software was made with Director. And this was done with the idea to support our understanding of the work and how it works, and opening up potential options to migrate that code in the future. So fast forward many years later to 2017, I was just finishing my PhD research, which was around the documentation of software-based art in a conservation context. And my Tate colleague, time-based media conservator, Patricia Falco, who I think is in the audience today, was devising a follow-up research project. So myself, Patricia, and another time-based media conservator, Chris King, would take insights from our research and practice over the years and further develop best practices for the conservation of software-based art. And really at the heart of this was a systematic revisit of all the historical software-based artworks in the collection. And for those carrying out disk imaging, we've already heard a bit about disk imaging today and how great it is, so I won't go over that. And emulation, same story really. So emulation of these pieces of software as the hardware ages, to demonstrate that that was possible, and to form the basis for future conservation work. Alongside all this, there was extensive documentation work, and we developed workflows that would help guide future work on these kinds of artworks. Much of what we did is shared on this project page. I think you can just Google Tate and software-based art, and it should be the first result. So in terms of workflows for software-based artworks which use video game technologies, of which there are quite a few in the Tate collection now, I would say overall they're not that different to our standard workflows, but there are various things that kind of complicate the way we work, which I'll come to when I talk about a specific example. The other important project I just want to mention is the Preserving Immersive Media project, which I've been working on with another Tate time-based media conservation colleague, Jack McConkey, since 2018. And this project was born out of some documentation research that was going on at Tate at the time. Jack was generating 360-degree video of artworks installed. And with a mind to kind of meeting an emerging conservation challenge head on, we started a small-scale program of research, looking at how we would preserve that material. And we focused particularly on the unique challenges of VR artworks, and learned a lot about how those are created, maintained, and archived, much of which is covered in a report which is published on the webpage. Again, I think you can just Google Tate and immersive media, and this should be your first result. So this research showed us that game engines were ubiquitous in the development of VR artworks. And this led to more research as part of that project, and now several chances to put that research into practice with acquisitions at Tate. These are a few engines you may have heard of. It's really two of these which I've seen most frequently used by artists. And those are kind of, I guess they are the big two at the moment, Unity and Unreal Engine. For anyone not familiar with a game engine, I'll just quickly give some information about that so we're all on the same page. These are pieces of software, usually quite large in scale, which are designed to simplify video game development by providing a tool set for building games. And the idea here is that this lowers the barrier to entry to making games, as you don't need to know about real-time 3D programming to work with one of these engines, but you can make a real-time 3D game. And the trade-off there is losing that level of control over the game's code. This isn't necessarily a big issue for most artists, but it does have interesting implications for preservation work. So this is the Unreal Engine 5 editor. This is the latest iteration in a long-running series of engines created by Epic Games. And working with a modern game engine usually looks something like this. You have some editor software you use to access the toolset and build your game. You get a kind of visual interface in which you can draw in assets, import it into the engine, build up your scene, build up your 3D environment, and then add things like code and other dynamic features on top of that. And then finally, still within this editor software, you can build an application from this project. So a piece of software that you can actually take to another computer and run it on there. And it's at this point of creating this software application, the kind of distributable version of the software, if you like, that a whole load of dependencies become baked into that software. And this is how we get locked into a certain generation of tech. And this is the source of our problems in terms of eventual hardware failure and obsolescence of the technologies involved. Dominant standards change, hardware fails, and eventually we can't run our application in a contemporary computing environment anymore. So to illustrate how this might play out, and some of the things we might do to prepare for it, I'm going to talk about specific artwork in the Tate collection. And this is a work called Refuse.exe by Ed Atkins. I don't know if any of you saw his show at Tate Britain, which I think I can't remember whether it wrapped up late last year or early this year. But this work was installed as part of that show at Take Britain, so you may have seen it there. So the work is from 2019. It was acquired by Tate in 2021. And I worked with the time-based media conservation team, so specifically with time-based media conservator Chris King on the acquisition process. So there's some video playing here. This is some documentation of the work installed at Gavin Brown's enterprise in 2019, actually before it was acquired. The work was built in Unreal Engine 4. It uses real-time rendering to simulate these groups of objects falling through space and crashing onto a spotlit stage below. And as the work runs, these objects gradually accumulate in a pile on the stage. And this process starts over every 13 to 14 minutes, doesn't have a fixed duration, and each run is unique and yields a slightly different arrangement to that pile of objects. You'll see from the video there are two projections which are presented simultaneously in the gallery space. So there's one is the portrait view of the objects falling, just in the upper space, and the second is a landscape view of the stage presented in the lower space. I think this was slightly different at Take Britain, but there's always two projections presented separately. And the software runs from a Windows PC, which is concealed in the gallery space. I think it's interesting just to think about this. What kind of is the work here? I mean, one of Atkin's collaborators described this as being more akin to a kind of visual poem. And I think that's a really useful way of thinking about it. And it really makes sense of the kind of formal approach that Ed took. There's a very specific sequence of things that happens over the duration of the work. They're very carefully choreographed in terms of pacing and sound design. Yeah, that's the way I've ended up kind of thinking about it. So let's look at what a museum like Tate might receive when they acquire an artwork like this. So in this case, we've got some components through from the gallery. We have the executable software itself on an external drive. We have a computer with the software already installed on it and ready to run. And we have a great manual in this case, which details how the work is installed. And this is all great. So we can archive copies of these digital components. And we can also set up a duplicate spare of the PC, which will be particularly important when the work goes on display, as it did. We can also take some measures at this point to safeguard the PC and the work it does in the eventuality of hardware failure. This takes us back to disk imaging again. So there's a tiny M2 solid state drive attached to the motherboard of this computer. So that contains all of the software environment needed to run this piece of software, including the operating system and any dependencies. So we can remove that drive from the computer, use this disk imaging technique and copy all of the contents of that storage drive into a file, bit for bit. And then this can provide a backup should the drive fail, and provide a way to access the data without needing to actually access the physical computer itself, which is also very useful. But potentially most important of all, it can form the basis of emulation, which I'll come back to. Something else we can do now is to commence the documentation work that will grow during the life of the work in the collection. This might include technical documentation, things like the specs of the PC needed to run it, but it can also include things like video captures. So here we have two recordings of separate runs of refuse.exe, which I've put side by side. And this can help us transmit something of how the artwork looks and feels now when it's running in a way in which the artist has approved of, and provide a really important reference for future testing of the work. So earlier on I mentioned source code as one of these pillars of our work. So what we also want to have really is source code for refuse. And for a game engine project, this is not exactly source code, but rather a set of project files which are developed in a specific version of the engine. And for refuse, not only do we have a project that consists of over 150,000 files, which is a massive scale compared to the typical source code we would get for a software-based artwork. But it also includes the editor itself, which is needed to access those files, and any other dependency requirements of that software. to actually open and work with those files. So yeah, this is quite a complex challenge, and we had some really great help from 2N Design, who were the development team on the software itself, and they helped us get it running, and a big thank you to Alejandro for that. And the fundamental question for us now, though, is how do we archive these source materials so that they can be accessed again? And what I've tended to do in this kind of work is to download and archive all of those dependencies as discrete components, discrete pieces of software. And unfortunately, in this case, these dependencies aren't always straightforward to grab and neatly archive. So, for example, this is a project which modifies the Unreal Engine source code slightly, so we need the Microsoft Visual Studio C++ build tools in order to build the project again. And these are only available via this Microsoft cloud-based downloader tool, which does everything behind the scenes. So it becomes a slightly scary thought trying to imagine how we piece together this software environment in the future when all these tools might have gone offline. The approach that I'm now moving towards in this kind of work is expanding the disk imaging process to also capture production environments. So in other words, we recreate the whole environment, computing environment needed to open and build the project locally on a physical computer. Then we image that drive and archive that. And that is, I think, relatively similar, at least, to the approach that some game studios are using. I seem to remember coming across a presentation by someone from EA Games many years ago, and they were doing something like this, although with more of a focus on virtualization and doing this at scale. And obviously, our processes are very much bespoke. In terms of actually doing preservation work with this material, from my understanding, we would be safe from having to make royalty payments to Epic Games to work with the engine. But I do find Epic's end-user license agreement to be slightly ambiguous in terms of preservation work. I'm curious if this is coming up in the video game world at all, given how popular game engines are. So if anyone knows more about that, I'd love to hear some examples. So with all of this in mind, let's just take a quick look at our longer term prospects for maintaining access to refuse. So as a thought exercise, I've kind of mapped some of our existing approaches to software-based art preservation onto this artwork, and I'll walk through those. So in the short to medium term, I think in this case, most of the parts of the PC are fairly generic. So we could use any number of PCs to run the work. And this is indicative of, we could potentially take a repair and replace approach to hardware in the short term. There is a specific signal output feature of the graphics card, NVIDIA graphics card, which has been used for display in the past. But it does look like there are other ways that we can achieve this if that's necessary. So I'm not too worried about that part. In the longer term is where obsolescence kicks in and we can't repair and replace anymore. So things get a bit more uncertain. And of course, one of the interesting and challenging things about software preservation is that we don't really know how obsolescence will unfold. Just based on my kind of research around this topic and trying to find a rough guide, it seems to me that game engine versions, at least for Unity and Unreal Engine, seems to be on a roughly 10-year schedule from when they're released to when they disappear from the maintainer's archives. So take from that what you will. There seem to be two main approaches to explore here. One is code migration, which involves modifying the code to keep the software running on new hardware. And the other is emulation, which we've already heard a bit about, but involves using software to run the original software unaltered on new hardware. So to do emulation, we could take the disk image we created earlier, attach this to an emulator, and in theory run the work. However, at the current time, because it takes quite a while for 3D technology to become emulatable, we can't actually test this at the moment. So there aren't full system emulation solutions that would be able to render something of this complexity. So 3D support in emulators is often quite limited, and I think in many cases people are falling back on virtualization and GPU pass-through as ways around this, but I don't think they're really solving the problem of obsolescence. So yeah, as we've seen with video game consoles, there's some lag between the release of a generation of technology and it actually becoming emulatable to a high degree of fidelity, which I call the emulation gap. My personal feeling is that this is likely to eventually be probably the most realistic option for this work, or at least part of the puzzle. Just to talk briefly about code migration, conscious that I am running out of time. So as in this case, we do have full source code available, we could look at working with these source materials to update the work. One pathway would be incremental migration. So we jump to new versions of Unreal Engine as they're released. And there is a migration pathway from the last version of Unreal Engine 4 to Unreal Engine 5. So it's at least theoretically possible. However, it's hard to imagine how a maintenance task of this scale would kind of fit in with the existing rhythms of conservation work within the museum. The alternative would be to wait a bit longer and move to a hypothetical different engine in the future. I have quite big concerns about this. I think given the amount of time that goes into constructing these projects, and that potentially includes the full Unreal Engine source code itself, and the amount of work that would be involved in extracting and converting assets, formats, some of which are specific to Unreal Engine, may have their own licenses. This just starts to look like a very complicated and resource-heavy task for a museum to undertake. And there's also some risk there, I think, of loss over time. There are unique characteristics to specific game engines, which I think may or may not be easily recreatable somewhere else. And what do we lose in that process? So that's just a recap. Because I'm running short of time, I won't do that. Just a recap of what I've talked about. Quick plug for the Preserving Immersive Media group. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, Jack McConkey and I started a specialist network called the Preserving Immersive Media Group that spun out of the tape project I mentioned earlier. So this is open to people to join if you're interested. And finally, our current focus is on something called the Preserving Immersive Media Knowledge Base, which is a resource for guidance on preserving immersive media. It includes lots of stuff on game engine projects. Thanks to some generous funding from the Netherlands Institute of Sound and Vision. We're actually in the process of a big update at the moment, which we'll share on the mailing list when it's done. And we'd also love help shaping this resource. So drop me an email if that's something you might be interested in. And on that note, here is my email address and my website. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Tom. That all looks really fascinating. As I said before, people feel free to put some questions in the chat box. And thank you for everyone who has already done so. Right, our final speaker on this panel is Manolis Varouchas, who is the founder and director of the Video Games Museum in Greece. Take it over.
Hello. So nice to be here. Let me share my screen quickly. By the way, my surname is called Varouchas, but it's quite difficult in English. It's okay. Let me do the proper window. I can assume you can all see my screen correctly. Perfect. So I'll do a quick talk about how we move from play to preservation, because we're a physical video games museum based in Greece. So I want to present the practical perspective from a video games museum. So, good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very honored to be here. I see some friends in the audience, some new people I'd love to meet. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to share a practical perspective drawn from the everyday work we have at the museum. Not only in theory, but direct experience, working with physical consoles, with aging items, with aging hardware, unpredictable software, and visitors who want to play and touch everything. So, from the beginning, we made one clear decision when we built the museum. This museum would not be static. It would be completely interactive. So that decision shaped everything that followed. In our museum, games are not only stored, cataloged, or displayed. Many of them are active. Visitors can engage with them directly. They can play. Children discover them for the very first time in their lives, where adults reconnect with experiences they remember from their own youngest areas. This changes the perspective and questions completely how we preserve everything. Because the moment a video game is played inside the museum, preservation is no longer only about protection. It becomes a matter of balance between access and care, between authenticity and sustainability, between keeping something safe and keeping it meaningful. So that's the perspective I'd like to explore. What does preservation look like? Use it as part of the museum experience. What changes when the museum is not only an archive, but also a living technological environment? And what does that mean for the way we document, we catalog, and we care for video games as cultural objects? So that's the journey we'll go through today. The paradox of the video games in museums. So let me begin with something that sounds simple, but really it's not. If you preserve a painting, you preserve the painting, right? If you preserve a book, the same happens here. If you preserve a sculpture, you preserve the sculpture. In its case, the object is relatively stable and self-contained. But when you try to preserve a video game, what exactly do we preserve? Is it the cartridge or the disc, the console, the controller, the display technology, the cable connections, or the experience itself? Because only you change if we change one of these elements above, the result also changes. So if you replace the original controller with a modern replica, the tactile experience changes at all. If you play a game designed for a CRT like Duck Hunt and the CRT mechanism with the light guns, on a modern flat screen, the visual experience and everything ceases to work or changes dramatically. So if your game receives an update or a patch, even the mechanism may shift. Very quickly, we realize that something fundamental. A video game is not a single object, it's a system. More specifically, it's a technological ecosystem made up of hardware, software, interfaces, and contexts. And that makes preservation far more complex than simply protecting a physical item. So unlikely most traditional museum objects, like most of you know, video games are interactive. They require electricity, input, activation. They only fully exist when they are in use. So a painting does not wear out because someone looks at it. A console, however, wears out when someone uses it. So components age, buttons lose responsiveness, plastic becomes fragile. But usage is not neutral. So without use, something essential is lost in video games. A video game that cannot be played is only partially preserved for us. You may preserve its material form, you may preserve its code, but you remove its core functionality, which is interactivity. This is the point where traditional preservation logic begins to struggle for us. Most preservation models are built around stability and isolation. So video games, by contrast, were designed for activation, variability, and technological dependence. So instead of asking, how do we prevent all change, we began asking, how do we manage change responsibly? That shift from preservation to management shaped our entire approach. Objects versus experience. At this point, the issue becomes even more specific. With video games, preserving the object is not always the same as preserving the work. A console can survive, a cartridge can survive in time, a disc, a controller, the same. But if the game is never activated, it's never played, and never experienced through interaction or real experience usage, then something essential is missing. Video games are not passive artifacts. They're not meant only to be viewed. They're designed to respond. It's not like television. So video games require input, movement, timing, sound, participation. So this creates a fundamental tension. The moment a video game is played, preservation risk increases. So buttons wear down, controller lose precision, internal components are placed under stress. And yet if we remove play entirely, we also remove the core function of the medium. What remains is only partial preservation. So we may keep the material form, but we lose the interactivity experience that defines the game. So for us, the question was no longer simply how to protect the object. It became how to preserve the experience and the relationship between the object and the actual experience. So that's where our thinking began to change. We moved away from a model based only on protection on the physical item, non-usable physical item, towards one based on careful management. So not only prevention of all change, but the responsible control of necessary change. And that changed everything in our thinking. The actual reality of a living museum. Video games are not only displayed behind glass. Some are, of course, especially fragile or historically significant systems, but a large part of the collection remains active. So visitors can sit down and play. Children encounter controls and consoles and controllers, especially from the 80s and from even the 70s and the 90s for the first time. Parents stand beside them and say, "This is what I used to play." Teenagers discover systems older than they are, the actual age, and suddenly history becomes interactive, a tactile, immersive. So that moment is powerful for us. This is always the turning point where preservation becomes more complex. Every time a visitor plays a game, hardware is placed under stress. A console, an actual console that works 12 hours per day, 365 days a year, is actually under a huge stress on temperature, humidity, and stuff all day long, and it cools down at night. So all plastics and power supplies can cause very, very serious harm on consoles and controllers, and of course the actual CDs and cartridges. So this is not a theoretical issue, it's part of our everyday museum operation threatening reality. So the question becomes very practical. How do we allow interaction, which is culturally essential, without accelerating degradation beyond control? So we quickly understood that a simply do not touch approach was not the real solution, like most physical museums. If visitors cannot experience the games, the museum loses something fundamental. So the artifact becomes distant and the experience disappears. But unlimited usage would also damage the collection over time, no matter what. So we chose the third path, a controlled integration with reality, with visitors. Not isolation, not unrestricted access, but structured access. In practice, that means planning. So it means rotating of consoles so the same hardware is not used continuously all year long. It means monitoring which system and titles receive the most usage by visitors. It also means that keeping backup units for key exhibition stations and more. And it also means replacing work components when necessary while documentation those interventional carefully. So we try to keep stats of every single bit that happens daily in the museum so we can be more thoughtful for the future sustainability of the items. So in our museum, preservation is not about freezing time. It's about managing the lifespan of our archive, or as we also call it, our vault. And this requires constant decision making. Every exhibition layout is a preservation decision. Every playable station is a preservation strategy. And every rotating schedule is part of a long-term care of a longevity system inside the museum's archive. So preservation is not separate from daily operation, it's embedded within it. So there's a deeper cultural dimension here. When a visitor plays a game from the 80s, like old games we used to have in 1985 per se, they're also not interacting with old hardware. They are connecting with a cultural moment. So we're not only preserving machines, we are preserving access to that specific memory of the visitors. And that makes the balance even more delicate. So if we isolate everything, we protect the objects, but we lose the part of its meaning. So if we allow unlimited usage, we preserve access in short term, but we risk losing the object itself over time. So preservation becomes a negotiation between balance, care and access, and playability and fun. So once we accept that the museum is a living environment, our documentation system must reflect that reality. And this is one of the most exciting moments of our life in the museum, is where we decide to develop our own custom collections management system. So why existing systems were not enough? When we began organizing the collection in a more structured way, we looked closely at existing museum collections management systems. Many of them systems are excellent, but they're not made for video games museums, which are not many around the world, right? but most of them are designed for relatively stable artifacts. So they usually assume a simple structure, one object, one record. That is not correct for us. And for many collections, even that may even work perfectly, but with video games, the logic become insufficient. So what actually is the object? Do we think one object is one cartridge or the console or the controller? Yes and no at the same time. Is it the cables? Is it the display technology adheres of the screens and stuff? In practice, the playable experience is just never one thing. It's always a combination of elements working together as a system. So if we catalog only the individual parts inside the museum's archives without documenting how they relate to one another, we miss the reality of how video games function in exhibition. So we realize that if we continue to think only in object-based terms, our preservation strategy will remain incomplete. That is why we decided to build our own custom collections management system designed especially for video games collections. So not because we wanted innovation for its own sake, but because we want the existing model not to deflect over time. Our custom CMS, as its core, our system is very practical. It's not created as a research experiment. It's an operational tool inside the daily workflow of the museum. So it helps us answer simple but essential questions. What is an object right now? Where is an object right now? Is it in storage, in the vault, in the archives, or in the exhibition? Has it been moved recently? What is current condition? Has anything changed since the last inspection? How often is it used? Does it need any kind of repair or spares replacement? These may sound like basic questions, but in a museum with hundreds and thousands of consoles and video games, the level of clarity for us is crucial. So the CMS records every console, every game, every controller, of course, includes boxes and manual. Each item has its own record, but most importantly, the system does not only document individual objects, it documents relationships between the items. It shows which console supports which game, which controller belongs to which exhibition station, which backup unit replaces which primary one, and which configuration was used during a specific exhibition over time. So instead of creating isolated records, we create relationship mappings. We are not only trying to document objects, we're documenting the whole system over time inside the museum and inside both in temporary and permanent exhibitions. So if a controller is rotated out of an exhibition, we log that. If a controller begins to show signs of wear, we log that, we record that. If a cable is replaced per se, the change is documented. So over time, this creates some sort of an extremely valuable preservation history inside the video games museum in Crete. So we begin to see patterns. We see which consoles are the most vulnerable, which components fail the most, which exhibition setups create the most stress. So without documentation, these patterns remain invisible for us. With documentation, they become structured knowledge base. So in that sense, our custom CMS becomes a form of institutional memory. Even if stuff changes, we may change a curator or so, the history of usage, of intervention, of decision-making remains in our archives. And at the end, the most important shift was not only technological, it was conceptual for us. System-based cataloging. One of the most important shifts in our work was moving from object-based thinking to system-based thinking. So traditional museum cataloging is usually object-centered. We identify the object, we describe it, we assign metadata, and we store it. With video games, that logic is not enough. So a cartridge on its own, it's not yet a playable game, right? A console on its own, it's not yet an experience. The artifact fully emerges only in activation, when hardware, software, and controller, and display, of course, work together. So we began asking different questions. We stopped asking what's the object. We also asked, how does this object function within a system? So it changes everything for the video games museum, because when something fails, and eventually something will over time, we do not just lose an isolated object. We disrupt a larger system, a larger ecosystem. So if we do not understand the system, we cannot preserve its memory properly. So our catalog does not stop on individual items. We also document relationship compatibility, versioning, DLCs, all kind of artifact and hardware dependencies we may realize over time. In other words, we preserve documented states rather than assuming permanent stability. Each configuration becomes a snapshot over time. So as we move on, as the years pass by, we have more and more history documented, recorded in the system. This allows us to maintain historical integrity without pretending that technological systems do not evolve. System-based thinking also forces us to account for context. Per se, a game designed for a CRT, as I said before, can look fundamentally different on a model LED screen or an OLED screen. So is the display part of the artifact? Yes and no at the same time, because a visual component shapes the experience. Have you tried to play a very, very old, from the 70s video game on an OLED huge screen in the living room? So preservation is not only about keeping code or hardware safe, it's about understanding the wider technological ecosystem in which the game exists. So hardware aging and versioning, one of the key realities.
Just should be on our way to wrapping up. Not too long. Thanks.
I'll be 2 minutes more. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I'll be fast. One of the key realities we had to accept is that technological preservation is always shaped by time. So hardware ages, whether it's used or not. So capacitors dry out, disk drives lose precision, rubber hardens, plastic becomes brittle, power supplies weaken, and importantly, many of those processes continue even when a console remains in storage, it changes over time. So, video games hardware inactively does not automatically ensure long-term survival. Let me be more quick. So, preservation as risk management. Ultimately, preservation becomes a form of risk management because we cannot eliminate risk no matter what we do on the museum. But we can understand it, we can monitor it, we can document it, and we can make plans for the future years to come. Without structured documentation, of course, decisions remain reactive. With documentation, everything becomes strategic. And what video games teach preservation? Working with video games inside the museum has taught us that something broader about preservation itself. Preservation, it's not about always preventing change. Sometimes it's about understanding change, documenting it, and managing it responsibly. So video games make the essential visible. The hardware changes, and we must face it the right way. Instead of what we aim for it continuously, we document states, we record transitions, and we manage lifespan over time. Video games are not single objects, they're a system. I said that before, sorry for that. And one last thing I want to say here is that the collections management system we developed is part of the approach. It's not just a database, it's a framework for informed decision making. And the last thing is that preservation for me and for us, for the Video Games Museum, is not the art of stopping time. It's a discipline of caring for complex systems as they move through time. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. So we've got about 12 minutes or so for Q&A. It looks like everyone has been very active in the chat already. Thank you, Wytze and Tom, for responding to a lot of stuff already. I did just want to pick up so Will's question about how are you and your institution preparing for preserving? Oh, could I get Wytze, Tom, and Manolis all on camera? Thank you. How are you and your institution preparing for preserving live service games or games that have an always online component? Just there's been a little chat going on there, but if there's anything that you guys wanted to say.
Well, I can kick off. My colleague Willem already jokingly said by crying in a corner mostly, but that's not that far off. in that sense that I can very concretely, nice mug by the way, say that this poses a problem, a concrete problem, a very practical problem as to, okay, how will we make this available? Are we going to have 24/7 servers running? But also, on the other hand, a bit more philosophical, existential problem as to what do you want to show to your audience? I mean, are you going to walk alone through World of Warcraft, for example? Would that be fun? The half of the game depends on working together, especially if you're going to do a raid, you need 40 plus people to actually be able to recreate that experience. Is it going to be the same? Is everyone going to start at level 60 to do the OG World of Warcraft? But those are... it's a very core question as to how do we actually want to experience games from, let's say, a cultural and a heritage perspective. Because in essence, we can say we already know that we can never recreate the same experience as it was like playing World of Warcraft in 2005. And okay, so we are not there yet, by the way, but when it comes to making stuff like this available. But these questions kind of like have to be addressed, and also from another perspective, what does the audience expect to get out of this? And maybe to make it more concretely for our collection, as I've stated in my presentation, we only have Dutch games in our collection. There is actually one Dutch MMORPG, Chronicles of Spellborn. I wouldn't even call it a cult hit because it went pretty much defunct after 5 months of launching. Big project, big game with a lot of big investors who had a lot of big ideas and didn't understand that much about games. The developers luckily did, but concretely for me, say we would run it 24/7. Who is actually in the know still about this game that they would come out and play it, So that's could be an interesting experiment. And I know that there is still a small cult fan base who would love to play it, but then you're like only playing with your friends, which is fun, but isn't the whole experience of playing an MMORPG. And that's I'll leave it at that for now.
Tom, Manolis?
Yep, Tom? Yeah, I mean, I don't have loads to say, mainly because it's not so much something that's on our radar at the moment. I guess live service games, well, I'm sure at some point, if it hasn't already happened, there will be a live service artwork that ends up in a collection somewhere. But yeah, it's not something I've encountered yet. I think for me, it makes me think about the connection with like web-based works, or software-based artworks we have which have some kind of online dependency, network dependency, so they require resources that are not under the control of the museum, and that's something where we essentially are accepting that there will be significant probably have to be significant changes over time in many cases in order to adapt to that. So we acknowledge that change will happen. So a lot of it becomes, I think, about documenting what we've got now. And, I'm thinking about like web-based works where part of the kind of protocol for dealing with these that's being developed, mostly due to the work of Patricia and Chris, is that kind of we'll do regular captures of websites in their current state, and then we use web archiving tools to do that. So that would be one approach. But when it comes to software, that's running client-based software, client-server software, that's a whole other ball game.
Thank you. And Manolis, anything on that, or yeah?
Yeah, we see live service games as systems with dependencies, not as a stable standalone object. So our approach will focus not only on software preservation, but on the infrastructure documentation, the updates, the player interaction, the versioning, the history, the updates. In many cases, documentation may become the most realistic form of preservation. So,
fantastic. So I've had a couple of questions from Manolis, but I do think they kind of translate to the others as well. Sorry, that's bouncing up and down in the chat. So first of all, on a kind of practical level, it's directly from Manolis, but I think it would speak to the others as well. Are you able to monitor the internal environmental conditions of the consoles and the physical media throughout the day? Are the physical conditions of the consoles and cartridges checked on an as-needed basis? Curious about preventative conservation measures. But also, have you treated the development and population of your content management system as a distinct project, or is it part of the museum's regular work? How is this kind of documented, and how does it relate to the kind of the broader work of your institution? That I think probably applies to all three of you. So we'll start with Manolis because he was the direct subject of the questions.
Thank you. I'll start with the second question. In our case, the CMS was not developed as something separate from the museum's work. Nice mug, by the way. It grew out of daily operational needs and became part of our regular workflows. So no, it's not considered to be, we don't consider the documentation to be fully completed because the collection is active. Bits and bytes instantly pop in every day. Objects move, conditions change, and exhibition changes creates all the time new data. So rather than a finished task, we see it as a living process that develops together with the museum. So let me find the other question as well. I think from Barbara, right?
Yes, that was about the physical maintenance of the hardware.
Oh, that's one of the hardest part we do with the museum. It's so hard to monitor the temperature of each and every console separately. So we have one technician moving around with notes daily, to be honest, weekly, but we try to make it daily and find which consoles are overheated, which consoles are in need of a repair. And we try to rotate, as I said before in the presentation, each and every console that it's under stress. Because something exciting in our museum is we're open 365 days, and we are the only museum in Greece that does that. And we are open from 8 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock at night. So all consoles that operate are constantly under stress. So we try our best to keep them safe by rotating them.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, shall I go now? Yeah, on the subject of hardware, so I mean the way artwork displays tend to work in a gallery setting is that I think a lot of these types of works will be on display for relatively short periods of time because of the challenges of running them for long periods of time. I mean, there are problems with heat management that we've definitely encountered before. It's really tricky. I think we're using scheduling sometimes as one way around that, so that the work isn't always running, the software isn't always running. But most of the computers are going to be in storage because we don't have kind of constant displays of console hardware. So that is, I mean, it varies with different places that I've worked with, but I think, yeah, in almost all cases, it's going to be stored in climate controlled art storage. So yeah, that's that part. And what was the other part?
About whether the content management systems were happening as part of your regular workflow of the institution, or whether it was something you were having to establish.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so content management system doesn't quite translate to. I'll talk about the take context because that's where we've done the most work. So it doesn't quite translate because there's a collection management system which houses metadata about artworks and their components. So part of the research Patricia and Chris and I have done in the past few years is updating the metadata there so it can accommodate software objects and hardware like computers better. So that's the one part to it. The other would be the storage of digital objects, I guess, and that is. Basically, there's a very new digital asset management system. It's not quite the right word, but you know what I mean. For digital preservation at Tate, which has just been rolled out in the last few years, and is now being used for moving image works. But an upcoming project that's already underway is to develop that for software components, which will be a new type and require a slightly different workflow, basically. But yeah, I think the metadata is quite well established, and I hope at some point we might be able to share an update of our metadata schema, which is an old version, is available on the Software-Based Art Project webpage that I mentioned earlier.
Fantastic, thank you. And yeah, Wytze?
Yeah, regarding the hardware question, our museum is a bit unique that we have a mostly interactive museum with experiences, just let's say 63 individual experiences built specifically for our museum. But the one that maybe pertains mostly to, let's say, commercially available hardware would be the VR goggle, which I also mentioned in my presentation. And funnily or sadly enough, that is broken most of the time because it's very hard to do the upkeep that is necessary to keep something like that, at least for us, active in our museum. We've made a specifically built VR goggle, 3D printing the case so you don't have to put it over your head, but you can just keep it in front of your face. Very practical. But why do we do that? Because it also frees us from putting, someone there to kind of like host or instruct the person who has to use that VR. These are very practical examples, but putting someone there costs money, So those are the kinds of considerations that come into place for us as when it comes to putting specific hardware in place. For example, putting a PS5 in our museum would invite a risk of, we have a lot of kids, of course, like literally by the busloads coming from schools, wrecking the hardware, So that's an analysis that we did and a decision that we made that most is idiot-proof, to use the Q term for it. And when it comes to our collection management system, we have a separate collection management system for the museum and a separate one for our collection. I gave a bit of a grid in my presentation also for how we split game collections, or for example, a game and the specific materials that we have on that. One of the difficult things for us is that but we are mostly a radio and television archive, and most television makers, so to say, use our CMS daily, our catalog daily to make new media. So we kind of like have, and if you were to say that television is a circle and a video game is a game, we're usually trying, a video game is a square, we're usually trying to put a square into a circle when it comes to making it easily available and putting it in our catalog, So there are a lot of times still problems coming up to make it available in that sense, but we have a specific sub CMS program to kind of like track our video games and to make that available. But that is not freely researchable, freely available for the public. You would always need me or a colleague to make that easily available or make that accessible for you.
Brill, thanks for that answer. So we're going to have a break now for a short break for lunch. We're going to be coming back at around 1:30. And then we're going to have the lightning talks. The presenters of the lightning talks, you're going to get notified about joining breakout rooms ahead of the next section. So just be on the lookout for that. And if you guys could join us back about 5 minutes earlier than 1:30. But yeah, thanks again, everyone, for your questions and for your lovely talks. Please feel free to put more questions and further conversations in the chat, or to hop on social media and hit us up there. So we'll see you back there at 1:30.